The Spin-off Podcast Network.
This is Kiwi is back for a brand new season with more inspiring kōrero from special guests including rugby player, father and role model TJ Perenara.
My family bring me joy. Rugby brings me joy too, but it's not the same joy as my family brings me.
And global dancer and choreographer Kirsten Dodgen.
For some reason, people think I'm very intimidating.
Listen to the new season of This is Kiwi, brought to you by the Spin-off Podcast Network in collaboration with KiwiBank. Available now wherever you get your podcasts. This is Kiwi is back for a brand new season with more inspiring kōrero from special guests including amputee, mum and wellbeing advocate Jess Quinn.
I'm most confident that I can get through almost anything. It doesn't mean that I nail it every time, but I am very confident I can overcome almost anything.
And musician, creative and content creator Taylor Roche.
I feel like big dreams always get challenged all the time, especially when you're doing something that's not traditional.
Listen to the new season of This is Kiwi, brought to you by the Spin-off Podcast Network in collaboration with KiwiBank. Available now wherever you get your podcasts.
Nau mai hoki mai ki other fold e mihi nei ko Duncan Greive tōku ingoa. My guest today is Robyn Paterson, who is someone I've known for a few years now. She first came on the Spin-off's radar when she signed on to direct On the Rag, the video series which ran for 2 seasons a few years ago, and just did an amazing job of taking what was essentially a chat podcast and helping us turn that into this sort of vibrant, quite extra production that it became for a minute there. But yeah, she's had a very long and storied career as a director. But she's here today to talk about her new company, Sweet Productions, and particularly Wheel Blacks, Bodies on the Line, which is a 3-part documentary, which I think landed this week on Neon and Sky. It covers the Wheel Blacks, the New Zealand men's wheelchair rugby team, which, and we talk about this is it's deeply connected to rugby, this national sport that is kind of everything to us. But the Wheel Blacks haven't had that big kind of outpouring of support that has flowed out of the All Blacks and into particularly sevens and then women's rugby in recent years. And you watch this and it just shows how kind of hard scrabble their existence is, particularly versus some of the competition in international wheelchair rugby scenes. But also you can feel the fact that this is gritty and it's real and it's not managed in the way that a lot of All Blacks coverage has felt like internationally. So we talk about that, but we also talk about Down for Love, which she was a director on. It's a show about Down syndrome people dating that became a hit locally and then a huge hit internationally. I went and looked up the sort of Netflix numbers, and its first run on Netflix, and they didn't have the worldwide rights, but it still kind of was just outside the top 500, which maybe doesn't sound like a lot, but that's over 16 million hours of viewing, and was sitting alongside the likes of Fear the Walking Dead, Insecure, The American Office, just these absolute juggernaut, always watched shows. And I think that tells you something about how this kind of sweet, relatively tiny budget New Zealand show just kind of grabbed people, and when you think about what Netflix dating shows are like, typically, it just says something about what they achieved there. We talk from there a bunch about the sort of journey of disabled content and how she and her partner Jai Waite are looking to kind of evolve that with Sweet Productions, and then finally about her role as president of DIGANS, and which is the Directors and Editors Guild, and how that interacts with sort of big institutions like the New Zealand Film Commission and New Zealand On Air, what proposals for a merger, what she makes of those, and how you sort of get out of this sort of deep funk that the local production industry feels like it's in right now. So yeah, really, really fun, kind of wide-ranging conversation with Robyn Paterson on The Fold. Kia Kia ora, Robyn. Welcome to the fold.
Kia ora, Duncan. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, and back to the spin-off. It's great to see you again.
Indeed, yeah, it's lovely to be back.
I wonder if you could start by telling me why the Wheel Blacks and like essentially what attracted you to them as subjects.
I mean, in some ways, why not the Wheel Blacks? You know, I mean, wheelchair rugby is an incredible sport. We have some amazing athletes in New Zealand. And, you know, we really wanted to shine a light on that. Like a lot of parasports, there's not a lot of awareness about our wheelchair rugby team. We really wanted to shine a light on that. And I have the wonderful advantage that my co-producer and business partner, Jai, is a former Wheel Black himself. So he brought an incredible amount of insight to the subject, and it felt like a really natural place for us to go. It's
interesting, right? Because in recent years, we've had kind of these sort of successive waves where Sevens has had moments in the sun and the Black Ferns. But when you sort of, you know, I was watching the trailer this morning, you're sort of suddenly, there's a missing piece here that doesn't feel like it's had the same kind of, in recent terms anyway, moment. Is that part of the sort of motivation here? Is that it might kind of provide that light that perhaps has been missing from the sport?
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned the Black Ferns. I think we've been on a really similar journey with women's sport where, you know, it's been really starved of airtime and therefore often funding and resources that go with that visibility. And so we really wanted to do the same thing. We were inspired by the Black Ferns documentary to an extent. The fact that it existed, that the Ferns were getting a lot more play, their tournaments were getting a lot more play. I'm a big fan. I've been, you know, supporting them for a long time. So to see that and to see the growth of the sport that way, and to have the opportunity to do something similar with wheelchair rugby was something that we really wanted to do. We knew we could do, and we really wanted to take that on and give it that space and that light.
What is the relationship between the Wheel Blacks and New Zealand rugby? Like, is it considered a sort of a related or a core code, or because it part of the sort of theory of the documentary seems to be that one of these things is sort of starving to a certain extent of resource compared to some other overseas wheelchair rugby teams? Yeah,
and that is an interesting question. In New Zealand, it's not associated with New Zealand rugby as a whole. In some countries, it is. That's changed and developed a lot over the years as well. The sport as a whole, and you'll see this in the documentary, has changed enormously over the last couple of decades in particular. And in many countries, it's got a lot more professional. And that's one reason that New Zealand struggles in this day and age, is that the same path hasn't happened yet anyway for New Zealand. In Australia, its major partner is Rugby Australia. In Great Britain, I believe it's the same, and there'll be other nations too. But the same is not the case at the moment for New Zealand.
Is that? I'm just trying to get at what's driving that. Like, has it ever been part of? Would it like to be a part of that? Because obviously New Zealand rugby, complicated organisation, doesn't always do right by non-All Black teams, but also something that has tremendous resource and power. That you can see that were it to be considered part of that core group of major national represented teams, there'd be some real advantages to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I mean, that's really a question for Wheelchair Rugby New Zealand in terms of what avenues they've tried and relationships they've, generated along the way. I'm not sure of the whole background to that. I mean, and there's a number of different ways in which wheelchair rugby can be funded and supported. Certainly in Australia, I think their association with Rugby Australia, it's not just funding, it's resources, it's training, facilities, it's those sort of things, and equipment. Your simple things, and that really all adds up to a package which allows people to be playing a lot more competitively in those international tournaments.
So, one thing, you mentioned the Black Ferns documentary, but, there is it's kind of a known issue really with the All Blacks that as subjects, they can be stoic to the point of impenetrability. An Amazon documentary a few years ago was kind of widely panned for basically because it didn't have that kind of introspection and the revelatory quality that a bunch of recent sports documentaries have had. How did you find the Wheel Blacks as subjects?
Yeah, I know what you mean. You tend to get the game of two halves answers.
That's right.
I think it is different with women's sport and with parasport, and I think with any sport that hasn't perhaps had the privilege of going through that professional machine, The players are more candid, more open. And also, they've really had to sacrifice an enormous amount to be playing at the level that they're playing at because they're not paid to do it. They don't have the facilities and the resourcing. So they're incredibly passionate about their sport and about what they do. They often want to talk about it. Having said that, there were definitely challenges. We're still talking about sports people.
And New Zealanders.
Who often, there's a whole, there's camera shyness and there's, uncertainty around, putting your head out too much. As a team, they were incredibly generous, though. I think those who could, step up for interviews really did, and were wonderful to work with. I think probably the biggest challenge that we face, which is also the challenge they face, is that they're very time poor. So all of these athletes are doing wheelchair rugby at an elite level on top of often 40-hour-a-week jobs, family life, and all the other commitments that they've got going on. So to then, on top of that, find time for documentary interviews, are going to be down the priority order. So people are incredibly time poor. But we had. You do find, I think, a lot more openness within women's sport and parasport for all of those reasons.
In terms of we're releasing, I think, on the 18th, so a couple of weeks away as we record this, and it's timed around the Paralympics, but that's not the ultimate destination. What is that a sort of a disappointment, or what's the sort of thinking around tying those things together, even though they don't have that same connection?
No spoilers, Duncan. What we're following is the journey towards qualifying for the Paralympics. And of course, yes, Paralympics is the big goal, but there's so much that goes into that journey. There's an enormous amount that goes into that journey. It's not only the pathway towards qualification, but what does that mean in New Zealand? What does it mean for the New Zealand team? There's, at one point they're trying to find just somewhere where they can train, a training venue. That's not a given. There's what goes into it for each of the players and getting to know those players. There's a lot of, sport is as any sport played by anybody anywhere, it has a wonderful natural unfolding narrative. There's the highs, there's the lows, there's the heartbreaks, there's the joys and the celebrations during, in a win, and the times in between where you really have to dig deep and find out, what does it really mean? Why are you doing this? And find the motivation to go on when you've perhaps had a disappointment, or you're facing a hurdle, or you're facing a challenge. So yes, the ultimate goal is the Paralympics, but there's a lot more that goes into it. Wheelchair rugby in particular, of course, and any parasport, it's a lot more than just a sport. For a lot of people and a lot of players will talk about this, it's been really life-changing discovering the sport, not only because of the opportunity to connect socially, work as a team, and to represent the country at an elite level, despite often, in many cases, having had an accident, sometimes through mainstream rugby. It's also, the players will talk about, many of them talk about, including Jai, my co-producer as well, will talk about how much they have learned and developed in terms of life skills by being around other players with similar injuries to them or similar disabilities.
So can you tell me a bit about your background and particularly the sort of path that led you to making productions with and about the disabled community?
Yeah, well, so, leaving aside Down for Love for a minute, I've always felt connected to the community in a lot of ways. Growing up, I grew up with a sister who has autism. My parents also later became wheelchair users, my mother through spinal cancer, my dad through motor neuron disease. I guess it's always disability, chronic health conditions have always been part of my life. When I was 16, I was diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis, and I was told at that time to prepare for being a wheelchair user by the time I was 20. Now, that obviously didn't eventuate, took a different path. I was later re-diagnosed with fibromyalgia. But it meant that I never took accessibility for granted from quite an early age. There was always that kind of question mark hanging over, and it made me think about it. It made me question it. And then, of course, after that, my parents both became wheelchair users as well. So that was always, I guess, in my world. So I felt naturally drawn to disability content and welcomed the opportunity to work on disability content through other projects and other companies, for a number of years, I think 2011, 2012. I first started working within the community and within disability content, amongst other things. So, yeah, it felt like a natural place for me to work, for me to sit, and certainly, I guess in terms of creating Sweet Productions with Jai, it's really taking that a step further and creating an environment where we really want to nurture people behind the screen as well who are living with disabilities, with mental health conditions, with chronic health conditions, and work in a way that's, flexible, that's going to enable people to have an authentic voice in that space.
You know, having made shows and made work in this space for quite a long time, what was it like to then get attached to something like Down for Love and just see that become kind of a global phenomenon?
Yeah, well, I mean, that was unexpected. I think when you're making, whenever you're making any show, you never know quite how that's going to be received. So it was great to see Down for Love have that international audience and to find that international audience. It's been really, really interesting hearing from people in the Down syndrome community overseas and having those conversations since it went out there. Yeah, I mean, that show had an entirely different process. We always wanted to... and this wasn't under Sweet Productions, of course. This was prior to starting Sweet. But the team who brought on board for Down for Love and I always wanted the possibility for it to sit in that international space, and we wanted to go about things. We really wanted to go about things, I think, in the right way. And by that, I don't just mean production values, but it was really important to me to work with the New Zealand Down Syndrome Association on that. Not just, kind of ticking it off at the end, but having a really meaningful connection from the beginning. Working with, Dan Buckingham and I sat down with Sandra from NZDSA really early on in the development process, and we were working through some of the subject matter that we wanted to talk about, things not to avoid, as well as things, to be careful of. We sat down with Carlos and some other people really, really early on, and that informed how the show was made from the beginning. So that was, I think, a key component of it as well.
But even, notwithstanding kind of hoping it would travel, I was looking up at the Netflix data and, it's sitting there, and I think in its first kind of bracket of release, it's sitting there alongside The Walking Dead and the US Office seasons. It's just a phenomenally popular show. And I guess, if you look at the sort of history of disabled programming in New Zealand, it's often a sort of a Sunday morning kind of attitude thing where there were, for a long time, there were assumptions that this didn't have kind of mass market interest. And it must have been, given the amount of care and attention and that belief in it to watch it, that really be profoundly disproven must have been quite satisfying.
Hugely satisfying, and I think there's an enormous amount of power in visibility as well, and in visibility that's not medicalised, because I think the way that we've tended to do disability content in the past has been quite niche, and it has been very much it sits over here, it's often in a medical model, and we're often talking about conditions in that way, or that there's as Dan used to describe it, there's sad music playing, and there's Coldplay and a sunset in a wheelchair. We really wanted to move away from that and to bring it much more into the mainstream. And absolute credit to the team that we brought on board as well, in terms of really seeing that vision through, and making it able to sit in that place. But I think things are changing in terms of people's awareness around disability, and around the hunger for that visibility. I think I've just had some incredible, very moving messages from the community, both here in New Zealand and also then internationally, in terms of what that meant for them. And sometimes it's also parents watching the show with their children who might be neurodiverse, or they might have, in this case, they might be living with Down syndrome, and the impact that the show has had for them being able to see themselves reflected on screen has been enormous. And that, I think, is really what motivates us to continue working in that space.
Kia ora, I'm Alex Casey, Senior Writer at The Spin-Off. We wouldn't exist without the ongoing support of our generous members. If you're able to, you can make a donation at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
When you went to set up Sweet, what was the thinking or the driving force behind having your own kind of production house with that level of kind of control and ability to direct the slate, I suppose?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think what you just said is really what that was about. You know, Jai and I are a similar age and stage. We've been in the industry a long time. We have a real alignment, I think, between us in terms of our values and approach and how we like to do things and what we feel like, I guess, is important behind the screen as well as on screen. There was an alignment there, and there was a sense that we were ready to do that in our own way and to try and create that environment as best we could. You know, we're going to get it wrong sometimes too, but to continue learning on that journey and to continue trying to work in a way that, you know, is empowering to people.
It's interesting you say that. I had Red Nicholson on the show last year, who's also, you know, come to disabled storytelling, albeit in a different form, with an idea that there is a particular way of doing it that felt like it kind of shrank the horizons in a way, putting words in his mouth. You know, and that there was a kind of an explicit critique of prior ways of approaching it. Is that something that you've sort of paid attention to? You're sort of touching on that a bit, that there was a particular way of framing and making disabled stories that feels like you're trying to kind of move through and into something else.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's not necessarily to knock what's gone before either. I think it's been an evolution. As you see with many, you know, areas of diverse representation, there's been a growth and an evolution over time as audiences come to understand it better, as people come to understand things in a deeper way. And then you see that growth and that evolution in terms of how it's done. And I think disability has been a bit late to that space. I think that we have seen changes in other areas prior to the changes in disability. I think we're much better educated now as audiences in terms of looking at content and saying and asking the question, you know, who's making it and why and what's the voice behind it, and who are in decision-making, you know, positions within that. I think disability content hasn't always come under the same scrutiny until recently. And this is not a New Zealand conversation per se, it's a global conversation. And now suddenly we're seeing a little bit of that same scrutiny applied to disability content, which I think is good. And also an empowerment of a lot of people to be behind the screen, to kind of come and you know, be part of content making where perhaps they hadn't felt comfortable to do so before or welcome to do so before.
So, you know, since you've set it up, you're partnered with Sky on this production. How did you find them as a platform to work with here, and you know, how easy was it to get this one up? I suppose I'm asking.
Yeah, that's always the $1 million question, isn't it? How did you get it up? Look, I think, you know, we were really fortunate with this one. I had seen that Sky had commissioned the Black Ferns documentary that was running, and that had been, it was something that I was engaged with, you know, as a Black Ferns fan and supporter. And I did, you know, sort of have a relationship with Annie Murray, who was the commissioner at the time. We had worked together. In fact, Annie was one of the first commissioners I ever worked with when starting in the industry. So I did reach out to Annie and get in touch, and because Jai and I had thought, you know, we really could do something similar with the Wheel Blacks, and there's an opportunity to do that, and it would be a valuable thing to do. So there was an alignment there. I think that you know, Annie understood that, and we put together a pitch on paper, and it went from there. So there wasn't a sort of an arduous process. But Sky have been really brilliant to work with across the board. You know, there's been a number of changes of commissioners in that time, with Annie, of course, now being at the New Zealand Film Commission. And across the board, they've all been fantastic and involved in a very helpful and supportive way. That's enabled us to continue doing things in the way that we feel, you know, they should be done, with that wonderful support and input that has added to the value of it. So, they've been fantastic to work with, and we're actually rolling into another production with Sky also as a partner now. We're just getting underway in pre-production for the next series, which is, That's
really exciting. On a sort of more industrial level, I just want to touch on a couple of things, particularly given that you are now president of DEGANS, which is Directors and Editors Guild. Is that correct? What made you want to sort of shoot for that position, and does someone with that experience and background within disability, does that sort of, having someone like yourself in that position, how have you kind of been able to sort of come into an institution like that, and whether it's affect change or just sort of start to make it kind of more able to engage with communities like that?
The answer to the first question, I didn't want to do it. I didn't want to do it.
It's a Jacinda situation.
Yeah. No, Jen, I'm not being disingenuous. It really was a situation where I was reluctant to stand in that position. I said no twice. I think there was a need for change at the time. Howard Taylor, who'd been the previous president, was ready to step back. He'd done it for a very long time. He'd been on the board since its inception, in fact, and had been president for many years. So there was a gap there that needed to be filled. I was not in a hurry to fill it, but there was a need for somebody to do it, and I was engaged with a lot of the issues that were happening at the time. I think I have a tendency to open my mouth and have opinions about things, and sometimes have public opinions about things, and then you tend to end up, in a leadership position without particularly meaning to. I think to answer the other, there's more we can talk about there, but to answer the other question, I think it was important at the time that the board did diversify, and, including having female directors more represented. There were some female directors, female editors on the board, not a lot. So it was time for the board to sort of focus more on diversity. I think probably me coming into play was part of that. And certainly that's been a focus of mine since coming into that role, is to try to encourage more diversity on the board. And I think that we are, improving in that way. I think you'll see that across a lot of boards now. It's much more on the radar, people are much more conscious of how important that is, that representation, because the conversations that you have at a board level are so intersectional. And it's important that that those viewpoints are represented. So there's a lot to unpack there. But I think, there's not a lot of perks to being on these boards and these representative guilds, but it is really important that I think as an industry that we do share the load, that we do take turns. It's voluntary, it's work on top of work that you're already doing. But the industry as a whole, we struggle with all the issues that we're dealing with. And I think I'm a big proponent of speaking out about that. I think that you can do a lot of complaining behind closed doors, but unless we are actually actively engaging with each other, actively engaging with our funding entities and our other bodies, and saying, hey, there's a pressure point here, this is not working, or people are getting caught in the mire in these areas, and really sitting down and talking together about how we can kind of work that through and how we can go forward together. I'm a little bit optimistic in how, I guess, I have an optimism around if we sit down and we talk together across guilds, across bodies, across entities, we can actually make a lot of progress, because at the end of the day, it's a small industry, it's a tough landscape, and we all want the industry to be thriving. And if I feel like if we can work together effectively, then we can make a lot more progress.
Do you think that, notwithstanding the reticence, now that you're in the role and trying to kind of take what you had been potentially outspoken about before and kind of operationalize it amongst the guilds, that you're starting to feel like some of those things, which are quite long-standing issues, intersectional issues, in different aspects of the sort of film and TV community, that you're starting to see more progress there since, in recent years?
Yeah, look, there's been a lot of change and a lot of progress in recent years. Some of that's been, challenging. We've been hit with all kinds of challenges as an industry, as you know. But I do think that there has been real progress as well in terms of that, like we were talking about before, that awareness of representation and how important it is. The focus on representation behind the screen as well as on screen. I know that some people struggle with that, and it's changed our funding landscape, but I also think we're really, really seeing the benefits of that in terms of people finding themselves represented when they watch content or when they listen to content, and really engaging with that in different ways. Our platforms, of course, have completely diversified in terms of that's outside outside of New Zealand. We're now looking at people watching their content in much shorter bites, watching on TikTok, watching on YouTube, watching very differently. So I think there's been a huge amount of adaptation in a really challenging period, but there are also positives that are definitely coming out of that.
One of the big sort of issues which is sort of hanging out there for the industry is the fate of the Film Commission and New Zealand On Air, and the space that you've worked in that you're describing kind of naturally kind of prompts that question to you. Do you or Diggans have a view about whether that's ultimately an inevitability or a desirable situation?
I think, are you talking about sort of the merger between the two?
I am. I
think if I can answer that, I'm going to answer it personally. This is not a Diggans position. This is a personal position because It's not a conversation we've had recently as a guild, as a board, and we haven't been asked to. The first thing I would say is that it's often talked about as two entities merging, New Zealand On Air and New Zealand Film Commission, but there are, of course, three. There's also Te Māngai Pāho, and we can't leave that out of the conversation. That conversation has to be had in terms of the three entities, not two. I guess the other thing, though, I'm wary. I'm wary, and this is not necessarily the view of everyone in the guild. Personally, I'm wary of the concept of merging. I think that often mergers look good on paper. They look efficient. They look, and there is, absolutely, platforms are changing. There is a lot more crossover between television and film. On the one hand, it makes sense. There's a lot more crossover now than previously in terms of the people working in both areas. You see film directors leading, TV shows and so forth, and that happens a lot more than it used to. So on the one hand, it makes sense, but I do think it's something that, in reality, I think mergers often make sense on paper, but in reality, they can be costly and problematic. I think you're dealing with very different entities that have different remits, that have different history, that have different relationships with the industry, and to bring them into one, sometimes you can lose more than you gain. I guess that's what my caution would be around that I feel wary about, around what that would actually look like and what that would actually create. Also, in New Zealand Film Commission, you've got an entity that's already in the middle of an enormous structural change. So I think it would be worth letting that happen and play out and shake down before there are too many conversations about merging. But this is beyond my pay grade.
It's beyond all our pay grade, but something might have to give. The general environment over the past year, particularly on the platform side locally, feels like it's never been so challenging. The losses at TVNZ, the something that looks pretty close to the end of local commissioning outside of New Zealand On Air at WBD, and just a genuine kind of an acceleration of audience attrition, and particularly in the sort of linear space. There's been a lot of conversation. I've seen Stephen O'Mar making some comments about that in the Herald, and John Barnett on this podcast. He's fairly outspoken at the best of times. What is your personal kind of feeling about, I guess, how we get out of this mess, assuming that there isn't a big fiscal stimulus coming on the local side, and if not the merger, then what do you think might provide a revival of the fortunes of the sort of commissioning production side of the industry in a local context?
Just the small questions.
Yeah, that's right. For a couple of minutes, and that should be all sewn up.
I'm afraid I don't have the answer any more than anybody else does. It is an incredibly challenging landscape at the moment, and not just in New Zealand, globally. I was hearing recently, we're working with an American company at the moment, and we were hearing that it's estimated 40% of the industry has been reduced in the US. So it's an incredibly difficult time, and it's been really, really heartbreaking seeing a lot of those losses. I certainly don't have any silver bullets on that one, or I think, also we just worst possible time to start a production company, but there you go.
Maybe they've heard you're busy though, so
Yeah, I do think though that it is going to take a lot of flexible thinking, a lot of adaptation, and a lot of looking at where. Looking at those new platforms. I think those of us who came through an industry that worked a certain way, that made content a certain way, for particular durations, particular platforms, and there's an inevitable, and I understand it as well, an inevitable kind of attachment to those ways of making things. But I think we have to look at how people in the younger generations are making things and watching things, which is so vastly different. I have a teenage daughter, and you look at, content that she will watch, content that she won't watch, and her friends. It's incredibly different from the ways that we've always made things and watched things. And unless we are prepared to be flexible and adapt, I don't think, I think it'll be even more challenging. It will make life even more challenging for ourselves. But again, there's no answers there, because monetizing that effectively, and obviously from a guild point of view, how do we maintain an environment where we are looking after people, paying people properly, providing people with the resources that they need to effectively sort of make content and to keep New Zealand content coming through. Yeah, I mean, this is something that we're all facing together, and we'll continue to.
Just to kind of confirm, are you talking about making more direct for the likes of YouTube and TikTok, just rather than through local platforms?
I'm not talking about that as being instead of. I'm talking about it more in terms of being as well as. And often that content is complementary to content that can sit on our networks and platforms as well. All I'm saying is that I think that the reality of that landscape is that we do have a really different viewership and a really different, sort of ways of viewing. So how can we harness that, I guess, and get it to a point where we're able to work effectively in an industry that's still supporting people?
Well, yeah, it's like you say, it's not a small question, but I really appreciate you coming on this podcast and attempting to wrestle with all this complexity while also talking about this beautiful show you've got coming out very soon.
Kia ora, Duncan. Thank you.
Thanks, Robyn.
Appreciate it.
We started doing a pepeha.
I don't know where I'm from. Yeah, I'm gonna go check with the chef.
Takeout Kids, a coming-of-age documentary series, returns for Season 2. From a Thai restaurant to a dairy to a nail salon, 5 young people balance school and relationships while growing up in their families' shops.
Are you working tomorrow?
Oh, school.
Watch Takeout Kids on the spin-off today, made with the support of New Zealand On Air.
Kia ora, this is Toby Manhire, here to urge you to tune in to Gone by Lunchtime, a podcast with me, Annabelle Lee Mather and Ben Thomas, tackling the world of New Zealand politics, from policy to polling, from scandal to psychodrama. Listen to Gone by Lunchtime, brought to you by the Spin-Off Podcast Network, wherever good pods are sold.
The Spin-Off Podcast Network.